A German Shepherd puppy protected his sister in a blizzard. What happened next is almost impossible to believe. In a cold so harsh it could freeze life itself, this tiny creature stood still for hours, just to keep his sister warm as she faded inside a soaking wet cardboard box. No one knows why he did it. No one was there to witness it. But one man, who was trying to forget everything, happened to walk into that moment, and it changed the rest of his life. If you believe that sometimes the deepest wounds are healed by the quiet gentleness of a dog, stay with Dog Stories. And don't forget to support us by subscribing to the channel. We truly appreciate every bit of support from you. And now we step into the journey as a homeless man searches for shelter, and the storm rolls in like a final test. The wind howled like a lost beast trapped in the heart of the city. Snow whipped sideways, so thick that even the streetlights could barely reach a few steps ahead. On a frozen sidewalk on the north edge of Cincinnati, a man pulled his worn coat tight around his neck and bowed his head against the cold that cut through skin. His name was Ray. And that night, he wasn't going anywhere. He was just trying to survive. Ray used to be a sergeant in the army. He knew the cold overseas, the loneliness during ambush nights. But the kind of cold back home after discharge was different. It didn't just wear down the body. It tore through your pride. Every step he took now wasn't toward a mission, just toward finding a dry, wind-sheltered spot where no one would chase him off because of how he looked. He dragged himself past an abandoned bus stop, once a regular rest spot before the local cops changed their patrol schedule. Beneath the crust of frozen snow were shattered beer cans, torn cardboard, and the rotted remains of broken dreams. That night, Ray wandered into a narrow alley behind an old grocery store, a place people like him usually avoided. But in a storm like this, every option was on the table. The wind ripped the scarf from around his neck. Ray paused to tie it back, and in that moment, he heard something. A faint sound. Almost nothing. Just a tiny stir, like someone breathing weakly under the snow. He squinted, trying to see through the whiteout, and then he saw it. A soaked cardboard box slumped next to a metal dumpster. Nothing unusual, until he saw it move. At first, he thought it was a stray cat or just the wind, but part of him knew. That feeling when something alive is out there and needs you. Ray slowed his steps. Each footfall cracked loudly beneath his worn-out shoes. He moved closer, crouching beside the box. His hands trembled, maybe from the cold, maybe from instinct. When he peeled back one side of the cardboard, his heart clenched. Inside, curled into a tight arc, were two puppies. One male, one female. The smaller one, the girl, lay still, soaked to the bone, her legs drawn up tight. But the other pup was standing. Yes, in that brutal cold, the little German Shepherd, all skin and bones, was standing on shaking legs, shielding his sister. His back was covered in snow. Ice crusted his muzzle and ears, but he didn't move. Ray looked into the puppy's eyes, and for a moment, everything around him went still. No more wind, no more cold, just that look, not the gaze of a scared animal, but the eyes of an older brother. A warrior. "You're protecting your sister, huh?" Ray whispered, like he was afraid to break something sacred. The puppy didn't bark, didn't flinch, just tilted his head slightly and stayed there. He was spent, but still standing. Ray didn't know when the tears started falling. Maybe it was that look. That look he knew too well. The look of someone who once gave everything for his team. There were no options left, no time. Ray ripped off his coat, wrapped the two puppies in what little dry lining was left and pressed them tight against his chest. The faint warmth from their bodies stung his frozen hands, but it also kicked his heart back into rhythm. He stood up, clenched the coat around them, and stared down the snow-covered road ahead. "All right," he said quietly, a vow meant for no one else. "We're not dying out here." And so, in the dead cold of night, a lost veteran took his first step toward a distant flicker of light. With two fading lives cradled in his arms, his chest burned as snow whipped against his face like needles. But it was the faint, fragile breaths beneath his coat that scared Ray the most. Inside, the two tiny creatures were shivering uncontrollably. He had no idea how much longer they could hold on. He just knew he couldn't stop. The male pup, the slightly bigger one, still tried to keep his head up, eyes locked on Ray's face like he was deciding whether or not to trust him. His short fur was matted with water and ice, ears drooping from the cold, But that stare, it was strangely steady. Ray tightened his arms around them. "Just stick with me, kid," he muttered. "We're on the same side now." He slipped through empty streets where the snow was so thick, his footprints vanished within seconds. It had been years since he'd carried anyone in his arms, or held anyone this close to his chest. And somehow, in this crazy moment, that closeness stirred something deeply human in him, a feeling he thought he'd lost a long time ago. Boone, the name popped into Ray's head naturally, still hadn't taken his eyes off him. Every time Ray checked to see if the little one was still breathing, those eyes followed, like the pup was on duty, protecting, watching, like a big brother. Maple, that's what Ray called the tiny sister, barely responded. She lay quietly in his arms, her breathing so faint that Ray had to press his ear to her chest just to feel it. At first, he thought she was gone, but then a small twitch of her nose, a soft exhale, enough to nearly make him break down right there in the snow. "Hang in there, baby girl," he whispered, knowing full well that words couldn't change the outcome. But like in the field, sometimes the smallest things, a word of encouragement, could help someone hold on for just a few more seconds. And sometimes, a few seconds was everything. A low growl rumbled from Boone as a gust of wind tore through. Not a growl to threaten, but a sound of pain, frustration, like he was fighting the cold, the fear, his own helplessness. Ray pressed his face to Boone's head and muttered, "I know that feeling, kid. I've felt that helpless too." The storm felt heavier by the minute. Most of the streetlights had gone dim. Ray turned, trying to orient himself toward the old shelter, a rundown warehouse that a few homeless folks could sometimes slip into if they knew the right people. He wasn't sure if the door would still be open, wasn't sure if anyone would be there. But he knew one thing for damn sure. He couldn't let these two lives die in his arms. By the time he crossed the 3rd Street, Ray's legs started to go numb. He stumbled, tightening his grip on the coat, afraid that even the slightest slip could cost them the fragile warmth keeping all three alive. Boone was still watching him, tired, but locked in. Ray felt a strange connection, one that didn't need words or gestures, just presence. When he finally reached the awning of an old restaurant, its yellow lights flickering weakly behind snow-covered glass, Ray stopped to check on them. He sank to the ground, back against the freezing brick wall, using his own body as a windbreak. He cracked open the coat, peeled back the scarf covering the pups. Boone's eyes, once so locked on his, were now closed. But his breathing was steadier. His head rested on Ray's shoulder, and his back stayed pressed against Maple like a shield. That kind of survival instinct, Ray thought. You don't learn that. That's something deeper. That's love. Maple let out a soft whimper, just one tiny sound, but it nearly made Ray drop everything. He tilted his head to look down at her. Her ear twitched. Just a little. Ray gently wiped her nose and ears with the scarf, whispering, "That's it, Maple. You're doing good." For the first time in years, Ray felt something beat inside his chest. Not fear, not confusion, something like hope. Fragile, but real. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, he could save someone. And maybe be saved too. He had nothing but himself. No blanket, no medicine, no car, but he had arms strong enough to hold on, a heart tired but still able to feel. And now, he had two tiny lives depending on him. Ray lowered his head, pulled all three of them in tighter, and closed his eyes. "I'm not letting you die. Not tonight." No one answered, but Boone pressed in closer to Maple, and Ray knew. They heard him. In the thick darkness of the storm, three lives quietly shared warmth. One man who had once given up, two pups who had never known a world beyond the snow, and between them something that had once felt lost, trust. The path to the shelter felt longer than Ray remembered. Maybe it was the darkness. Maybe the snow had buried every familiar turn. Or maybe it was because he was carrying two fragile lives in his arms, and each step felt like dragging the weight of his own past. Ray hunched lower, shielding Boone and Maple as they curled up inside his coat. They weren't shaking as much now, but the warmth hadn't fully returned. He could feel them press closer to him every time the wind screamed through an intersection. Maybe it wasn't trust, maybe it was just instinct, but the feeling still made him clutch the coat tighter, like a silent promise. Under the thick layer of snow, familiar streets felt foreign. Signs leaned from the wind, traffic lights blinked red in uneven pulses. Ray crossed without knowing what time it was, Didn't care, really. The only thing he kept track of was breath. His and the two pups. Every minute they were still breathing was one more reason not to stop. A corner of memory stirred as he turned onto the road that led to the old shelter. Images of other cold nights surfaced, last year, 10 years ago, even from halfway around the world. The same skin-cutting cold, the same silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Back then, Ray was a soldier. He had teammates, orders, a mission. Now, he was just a shadow trying to keep two tiny lives from slipping away. Not so different, huh? Ray muttered. But it was different. Back then, he had belief. He had people who needed him. After discharge, everything fell apart. His family unraveled under the weight of nightmares he couldn't explain. Friends faded, one by one. No one really knows how to talk to a man who wants silence all day. Eventually, he started avoiding everything, until he even avoided himself. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, he couldn't look away, couldn't shut down. Boone wouldn't let him. The way the pup looked at him, no begging, just trust. Like in this freezing, unforgiving world, Ray was the only thing left worth believing in. "I've walked away from too much already," he whispered, passing a row of abandoned buildings. "Not this time." A brutal gust slammed into him, nearly knocking him down. He staggered, his knee cracking hard against the curb. Pain shot through his leg, but he didn't stop. He just looked down at the snow starting to crust over his coat, gathering on Boone's head. The pup didn't whimper, didn't move, just stayed still, like he knew even the smallest shift could cost too much. Ray bent down, brushed the snow away. "We're almost there. Hang in." His voice was rough, barely above a rasp. But strangely, the moment he said it, he could breathe a little easier, like maybe he needed to hear it too. The shelter came into view around the corner, its dim lights smeared by the snowstorm. It wasn't some polished facility, just an old warehouse where a few people had pitched tents in winter. Ray had spent 2 weeks there last year, back when his boots still held out the cold. He didn't know if it was still open, but at least it had a roof. And maybe hope. As he got closer, he saw the side door was still propped slightly ajar. No lock, just a wooden plank wedged loosely across it. Ray pushed it open with his shoulder, inch by inch, then slipped inside. No lights, but the wind stopped, and in that sudden stillness, he let out a long breath. He slid down against a cracked brick wall, carefully unwrapped his coat and pulled Boone and Maple in close. Boone's lips moved slightly, a soft sigh, weak but alive. Maple was still out, but Ray could feel her fragile heartbeat beneath her thin fur. He pulled out an old scarf from his backpack, one of the few things he'd managed to hold on to over the years, and wrapped it around all three of them. It wasn't warm enough, but it was everything he had. He looked up at the dark ceiling. The wind howled outside like whispers from the past. But this time, he didn't listen. He didn't think about who he used to be. Didn't think about the mistakes, the losses, the nights he wished he wouldn't wake up. He only thought about the two tiny lives, fast asleep in his arms, and the strange, quiet miracle that they made him want to live again. "Boone, Maple," he whispered, gently touching each of their heads. "Thanks for not giving up. Now it's my turn." The door opened with a long, creaking groan, a slice of fluorescent light cutting through the darkness like a blade. Ray stepped inside, cradling the coat wrapped around Boone and Maple against his chest, his legs numb from over an hour of walking through the storm. The smell of antiseptic and the sudden warmth hit him hard, not because it was too hot, but because it felt safe, something he hadn't felt in years. Jules was the first person he saw. Short hair, early 30s, wearing a t-shirt with the shelter's logo, gathering up linens and getting ready to close for the night, until Ray walked in. She turned, her eyes flicking over him for just a second, then landing on the slight movement beneath the edge of his coat. "What's going on?" she asked, already moving toward him without waiting for an answer. Ray loosened his coat just enough to reveal Boone's tiny head, drooping, and Maple curled up, unmoving. That was all it took. Jules spun around and shouted into the back, "We've got an emergency. Get warm fluids, heating pads, prep table 3 now." The room snapped to life in seconds. 2 staffers appeared, one with towels, another bolting off for heat packs. Ray stood frozen, unsure whether to let go or hold on tighter. Then Jules turned back to him, hand outstretched, voice softer now but steady. "We've got them. Are you okay?" Ray gave a small nod, though every muscle in his body was locked tight. He leaned down and placed Boone and Maple on the table like they were made of glass, seconds from breaking. Boone let out a weak whimper as he was lifted away from Ray's chest. His eyes opened, searching, locking onto Ray's once again. No pleading, no fear, just trust. "We'll keep them together," Jules said, gently positioning Maple beside Boone. "Separating them right now would do more harm than good." Ray didn't know why, but those words caught in his throat. He turned away, trying to hide the tremble rising from his chest. The waiting area was small. Just 2 plastic chairs and a hot water machine that didn't work. Jules handed him a cup of lukewarm coffee, the kind of thing Ray couldn't remember the last time he'd held. He took it, didn't drink, just stared through the glass, watching those 2 tiny bodies being dried, rehydrated, their temperatures checked. "You the one who found them?" Jules asked, turning to him after washing her hands, eyes still following the staff moving around the room. Ray nodded. "I wasn't planning to come here. Just ran out of road." "Lucky for them you didn't turn back," Jules said. She didn't smile, just looked at him like she recognized something. "You seen a lot of people like me?" Ray asked, voice rough. "Been a person like you," Jules replied simply. That stopped him. For the first time in a long while, Ray didn't feel like he had to explain anything. Didn't have to hide the old wounds or pretend he was okay. He just sat there, watching the 2 pups lying side by side, warming each other, and saw himself in them. He'd been Boone once, standing in the storm, shielding the ones he loved, hoping that if he was just strong enough, it would all pass. But it doesn't always pass. Ray didn't say anything about his ex-wife, about the daughter he doesn't get to see, about the nightmares that came so often he had to walk away from everything, afraid of who he might hurt. And Jules didn't ask. She just let him be. When the shelter dimmed the lights for the night shift, Ray still didn't leave. Jules handed him a thin blanket and pointed to the bench near the heated kennel where Boone and Maple were sleeping. "We've got an empty room, but I figured you'd want to stay close." Ray didn't say a word. He just sat down, curled up, and stared through the mesh door. Boone was asleep, still pressed tightly against Maple. Even with his tiny body completely drained, he clung to his sister like letting go would make them both disappear. And in that quiet moment, something cracked open inside Ray. Not pain, not guilt, something else, softer, fragile. A small voice from the part of his heart he'd long since boarded up. Family, no blood ties, no paperwork, just a place to come back to, a life to protect, and someone who made him want to hold on to himself. He pulled the blanket up, leaned his head against the wall, and for the first time in years, closed his eyes without fearing what dreams might come. Boone shifted slightly in his sleep. Ray whispered through the mesh, "Get some rest, kid. I'm here." The next morning, the shelter's soft yellow lights shifted into daytime mode, gentler, warmer. Jules walked into the care area, coffee in hand, ready to start another early shift. But what she saw at the door made her stop in her tracks. Boone's eyes were open. The tiny German shepherd, barely 8 weeks old, was lying on his side next to Maple in the heated kennel. His big dark eyes were fixed on Ray, who was still slumped on the bench outside the crate, blanket slipped off his shoulders, hair a mess, face drawn from exhaustion. Boone didn't move much, just blinked slowly and lifted his head, barely. Just enough to show he was coming back. But what stopped Jules cold wasn't the fact that he was waking up. It was the way he kept one tiny paw resting on Maple, as if letting go, even now, meant she might slip away. "Boone," Jules whispered, placing a hand over her chest. There was something sacred in the way this little dog moved. Not just instinct, something deeper, a kind of vow no one could ever teach. Ray stirred at the sound of Jules's footsteps. He jolted upright, an old reflex firing instantly, his eyes still foggy but alert. Then he looked toward the heated kennel, and his heart kicked hard when he met Boone's gaze. Boone didn't bark, didn't flinch, but the way he looked up, quiet, steady, made Ray press his palm to the cold metal bars. "You stayed," he said softly. "I was afraid." Boone didn't look away from Ray, but every time Maple made the slightest movement, he immediately turned his head to check on her. When Jules opened the kennel to adjust the heated towel, Boone let out a low growl, weak but firm. Not fear. A warning. "Don't touch her unless you have to." Jules raised both hands, speaking gently. Just trying to warm your sister up, little warrior. Boone let her, but he stayed between her and Maple the whole time. When Jules pulled her hands back, Boone stretched his neck and licked Maple's ear, slow, deliberate, tender. Ray stood there in silence, but his hand curled into a fist, not from anger, but from holding back everything rising inside him. He'd seen that kind of thing before, in people, in the most dangerous corners of the world. A teammate using their body to shield another, a brother, a friend, a soldier. And now, he was seeing it again, in a puppy not even 8 weeks old. That little guy didn't just survive, Jules said as they stepped away from the kennel a while later. He protected. No one taught him that. Ray nodded quietly. He's the kind of soul that loved the second he opened his eyes. From that day on, something shifted in the shelter. Staff walked softer. People bringing in pets for vaccinations lingered longer at Boone and Maple's kennel. Some couldn't hold back tears at the sight of the tiny pair lying side by side, always touching. Like having each other was the only thing keeping them alive. Boone recovered, little by little. He started moving more, took a few drops of milk through a syringe, even wagged his tail when Ray leaned close and called his name. But one thing never changed: his eyes. Whether he was eating, sleeping, or waking up, Boone always turned to check on Maple. He wouldn't do a thing until he was sure his little sister was still there, still breathing, still safe. Jules noticed Ray changing too. He no longer curled up in the corner seat, no longer nodded quietly, then stayed silent for hours. Every time Boone stirred, Ray was the first on his feet. Every time Maple took a deeper breath, he was the first to smile. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. An invisible thread was forming between Ray, the man who had once given up on everything, and Boone, the puppy who never did. And in that quiet, something was healing. Ray had planned to leave the next morning. He thought he was just passing through, one more night in a long string of places he never stayed. But as he stepped toward the door, he heard a soft bark from Boone behind him. Turned to see Maple pressing her face into her brother's chest like she always did, and he just stood there, frozen. No one stopped him. No one asked him to stay. But when Jules quietly set her hand down on the table, light as air, saying nothing, it was enough. Ray let go of his bag. He turned back, unwrapped his scarf, and said, "Anything around here that needs doing?" Ray started each morning by mopping the floors. No one told him to. His name wasn't on any roster. But from the day Boone opened his eyes and Maple began to stir, and both of them started to heal, Ray stayed. As if he'd belonged there all along. He quietly cleaned the exam area, folded fresh towels, replaced the cooled heat packs in the kennel. Jules saw all of it, but said nothing. She knew some wounds don't need medicine, they just need time, space, and a reason to keep going. Boone could sit up now, though his legs were still shaky. Every time Ray walked in, Boone was the first to lift his head. Maple still curled up right beside him, fragile, but the pink had started to return to her nose and paws. Ray always rested his hand through the bars so they could touch him whenever they needed. At first, the staff figured Ray would stay a few days, but he never left. He started working like it was his duty, shoveling snow outside, checking the heaters, even fixing the stuck door to the supply room. No one paid him, and he never asked. "You doing all this for the pups?" Jules asked one afternoon, catching Ray scrubbing a stain off the glass door. Ray didn't look up. "I'm doing it because I used to be one of them." "You mean?" "Left behind. Lost. Trying to survive by protecting someone else, just to forget I was freezing too." Jules said nothing. Ray's voice was quiet, but the words hit deep. Honest in a way that hurt. By day 7, Boone was on his feet, walking a few wobbly steps inside the kennel. He stumbled, but refused to stay down. Maple still needed help, but she was making progress, slow, steady. She'd begun licking Ray's hand when he reached in, eyes still wide, but no longer afraid. One night, Ray stayed longer than usual. Snow had started falling again. Not as fierce as that first night, but cold enough to settle deep into your bones. He wrapped a scarf around his neck, sat on the floor beside the kennel, back against the wall, arms resting on his knees. Inside, Boone was asleep. Maple had just finished her formula, curled against her brother, her head resting on his back. Ray looked at them like he was staring at an old photograph, something quietly beautiful, something that made your throat catch. "I've walked away from a lot of people," Ray said quietly, not clear if he was speaking to himself or to Jules, who was making tea across the room. Family, friends, even myself. Jules didn't answer. She just poured the tea and listened. But they never walked away from each other. Ray turned his eyes to Boone and Maple, his voice dropping lower. In the face of death, the cold, hunger, Boone stood there, shielding his sister like she was the only thing that mattered. He let out a long breath, something shifting in his eyes, something both new and familiar. "I'm not leaving them," he said, this time louder, firmer. "A promise." Just like they never left each other. Jules looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. No hand on the shoulder, no comforting cliches, just quiet acknowledgement, because sometimes a silent decision is the one that reshapes your whole life. From that night on, Ray wasn't an outsider anymore. He became part of this place, and more than that, part of a family he hadn't been looking for, but was given exactly when he needed it most. The grass was still damp from a light night rain, but the first sunlight after days of snow had started to filter through the leaves, casting soft gold across the small park a few blocks from the shelter. The air carried a hint of early spring warmth, just enough for 3 lives that had almost slipped away to step outside together for the first time. Ray held the leashes tightly, walking slowly to match the pace of Boone and Maple. Boone led the way, ears perked, nose twitching as he sniffed every blade of grass, every branch along the path. Maple stayed close behind, smaller, more cautious, but her eyes no longer held the cold, wet fear of those early days. They were healthy now, not fully, not yet, but enough to walk beside Ray on ground no longer buried in snow. The park wasn't crowded. A few people walked their dogs. An elderly couple read the newspaper on a stone bench, and one little girl sat alone near a flower bed, clutching a porcelain doll to her chest. Ray noticed her immediately, because of her eyes. She sat perfectly still, knees pulled tight to her chest, the edge of a red scarf frayed at the ends. Her gaze wasn't fixed on anyone in particular. It was scanning the world like she expected something to go wrong. Boone ignored everyone. Maple didn't tug on the leash, just walked quietly by Ray's side. As they neared a stone bench a few meters from the little girl, Boone stopped. He sniffed the air, then sat down like he'd decided this was the place to pause. Ray was about to sit too when Maple leaned forward, just slightly toward the girl. Not tugging, not lunging, just a small, subtle movement, like something was quietly pulling her in. At that exact moment, the little girl looked up. Her eyes met Maple's. Nothing dramatic happened, no smile, no shout. But in that look, Ray saw something he'd never seen in a child's eyes aimed at him: trust. Maple stepped forward, slow and steady, just a few steps, then lay down. The girl didn't flinch. Instead, she set the porcelain doll gently on the ground and leaned in, carefully, like she didn't want to break the fragile moment. Her tiny fingers reached out, brushed over Maple's soft ears. Maple didn't move. Boone didn't move. And Ray held his breath. A few seconds later, the girl whispered, barely loud enough to hear, "She's not afraid of me." Ray turned his face away. His eyes burned. He thought he didn't have any tears left, not since the last time he hugged his daughter before walking away from that old house, afraid that one bad night might be enough to hurt her forever. But that one sentence, simple and clear, cracked the stone wall he'd built around himself for years. Boone stepped closer, settling beside Maple. The little girl looked at both of them, then glanced up at Ray. "Are they yours?" she asked, her voice steady. Ray nodded, though his throat locked up. "I used to be really scared of dogs," the girl said, "but she looked at me like I was someone worth getting close to." Ray couldn't find the words. He just sat down on the grass, a few steps away from the girl, and for the first time, he didn't feel lost in the world. 3 lives, once on the edge, now lying peacefully on green grass, beside a quiet little girl, on a morning so calm it almost felt unreal. And for Ray, it was the first time he truly felt seen. That afternoon, when Ray returned from the park, Boone and Maple lay asleep on the floor near the front desk. The late-day sun streamed through the glass, casting 2 faint shadows pressed close together, in a bond they never seemed to break. Jules was jotting notes into a medical log, and looked up as Ray set a water jug down on the counter. "Looks like you found something out there today," she said, still writing, not looking at him. Ray gave a small nod. the memory of the girl still lingering in his eyes. "I don't know what it was," he said quietly, "but it made me feel real." Jules closed the logbook and leaned her elbows on the counter. "I've got something to run by you, a suggestion. Not sure you're gonna like it." Ray raised an eyebrow, his old instincts kicking in. "There's a support program for veterans," Jules said, "specifically for those dealing with PTSD, homelessness, or trouble reintegrating. It combines therapy with animal care." Ray didn't respond. Just hearing the word PTSD was enough to make him want to turn and walk out, like he had every other time. He hated that word, not because it was wrong, but because it was too damn right. It stripped him bare. "The program's got a facility right here in the city," Jules went on. "They offer housing, free therapy, life skills training, but the reason I'm bringing it up is they're looking for someone to lead the animal therapy group." Ray frowned. "I'm not a doctor." "You don't need to be. You just need to be real and able to connect with animals." She glanced down at the two sleeping forms under the desk and with people. Ray looked at Boone, then at Maple, and something inside him softened. "You're saying me and them would be working with other people?" Ray asked. "Not right away," Jules said, her voice softer now. "They'll train you, observe, guide you. But the condition for joining is Boone and Maple go with you, all three of you together." Ray turned away, resting his hand on the arm of the chair. He wasn't good with people. He knew that. But he also knew this. If someone had once told him a tiny dog could save him, he'd have laughed in their face. And yet here he was, still breathing because of two little lives. He sat in silence for a long time. Then finally he asked, quietly, "Can I say no?" Jules smiled. "Of course, but I think you already know your answer." Ray leaned down and scratched gently behind Boone's ear. The little German shepherd lifted his head and nudged Ray's hand like it was a routine they'd had forever. Maple rolled over in her sleep, draping a paw across her brother's belly. A family. Not perfect, but enough. Ray exhaled, his voice still rough but firm. "Then, I'm in." 1 year later, winter returned to Cincinnati, but this time, Ray wasn't afraid of the cold anymore. He lived in a small apartment on the second floor of an old building. Nothing fancy, not spacious, but it had a heater, a window that caught the morning sun, and a rug that always had 2 patches of dog fur pressed into it like permanent signatures. Boone liked to lie near the door, watching everything that moved outside. Maple preferred the couch, curled into a soft spiral, head resting on a pillow, eyes half closed like she was always mid-dream. They were no longer just survivors fighting for every breath. Now they were a team, a symbol. Ray worked part-time with a veteran recovery program, but his real work wasn't in any paperwork or on a payroll. He brought Boone and Maple to shelters, counseling centers, sometimes to quiet gatherings in city parks. Wherever there were people unraveling, they showed up. No introductions needed, just presence. Boone had grown fast. He looked every bit the German shepherd now. Strong, sharp, but never forgot how to lower his head gently when approaching someone shaking on a bench. Maple stayed smaller, softer. She knew when to rest her head in someone's lap, and when just being close in silence was enough. Between the three of them, there was a rhythm. A trust that needed no words. There were days when Ray watched Boone lying beside a veteran who hadn't slept in 3 nights from nightmares, then watched that same man drift off with a hand resting gently on the dog's back. There were afternoons when Maple would stay curled beside a woman recovering from years of addiction, letting her cry for hours without a single word exchanged. "They're not trying to do anything," Ray often told new faces. "They just show up, and sometimes that's enough." People started calling them the Brave Three, not because of what they'd survived, but because of how they showed up now. Steady, quiet, present, unshaken. Ray never told his full story to anyone but Jules. But he didn't have to. Every time he walked into a room with Boone and Maple, the shift in the air told it for him. Tension became stillness. Silence turned into space where people could finally breathe. Once, a middle-aged man who had just finished serving time sat next to Ray after a therapy session. He didn't make eye contact, just muttered, "Thanks for bringing them." Ray simply replied, "They're the reason I'm still here." And that wasn't an exaggeration. From a lost veteran without a stable bed, Ray had become a guide, not through lectures, but through the way he lived. Every day, He brought Boone and Maple close to someone breaking apart, and somehow the three of them brought a small piece of healing back with them too. They weren't a miracle. They were just three lives that had once stood on the edge and chose to keep going. The old alley didn't feel as frightening now. The snow was gone, the sidewalk exposed its cracked, uneven bricks, and the rusted metal dumpster had been replaced by a clean, newer plastic bin. But Ray still recognized every fracture in the brick wall, every shadowed corner where the wind used to howl like a warning from fate. Boone walked ahead, slow, steady, sure. Maple followed, glancing back at Ray as if to make sure he was still there. All three stopped at the exact spot where the soaked, cardboard box had once rested, the place where everything began. Ray stood still, drew in a deep breath. The old smell was gone, but the memory remained, clear as ever. He knelt down, hand resting gently on the damp ground near the wall. Nothing remained, no trace of that night. But inside him, every detail came back sharper than ever. The howl of the wind, the shallow breaths, that look Boone gave him, the first look that made it impossible to walk away. If I hadn't stopped that night, if I hadn't heard something faint under the storm, if I'd just walked by, like so many others did. Ray looked up, staring at the empty space where the box had once been. Maybe I wouldn't still be here either, he whispered, mostly to himself. Boone stepped closer, gently resting his head against Ray's leg. Maple lay down beside them, as if this place, this quiet corner of a once-forgotten alley, was a part of their story too, a memory woven into their bones. None of the three spoke the same language. But they understood, deeply, that if one man hadn't stopped, hadn't made a choice, none of them would be here, sharing this path. Ray reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. It was his old military dog tag, metal dulled by time. He hadn't carried it in years, not until recently. Not to remember war, but to remind himself he had once belonged to something bigger than just himself. He pressed it gently into the earth, right where the cardboard box had once been, not as a goodbye, but as a marker, the place where everything changed direction. I don't need a battlefield to know who I am anymore, Ray said. I just need these two. Boone gave a single wag of his tail, as if to confirm it. Maple looked up at him, eyes bright, not with fear, but with trust. Ray stood, brushing his hands against his pants. Morning light began to spill through the buildings, casting soft gold across the alley that had once been cold and forgotten. It wasn't a place of abandonment anymore. It was a beginning, the place where three broken hearts had found each other, and slowly, day by day, began to mend. He looked at Boone and Maple, now standing side by side, head to head, shoulder to shoulder. No papers, no blood ties. They were family, an unexpected family, but sacred all the same. And as the sunlight poured into the alley, flooding the once shadowed space with gold, all three turned their backs on the past and walked forward. Not fast, not rushed, but steady. Because love doesn't have to be perfect to save someone. It only has to be chosen every day by those willing to stay. Some encounters feel like chance, but end up changing everything. Ray wasn't looking for a family, but he found one. In the eyes of a tiny German shepherd, and in the fragile breath of a little sister protected with everything her brother had left. Boone and Maple didn't just survive the storm. They taught Ray, and all of us, that love doesn't need to be flawless. It only needs to endure, and that sometimes saving someone else is exactly how we save ourselves. If this story moved you, hit subscribe to follow Dog Stories, a space where brave hearts and quiet lessons from the world of dogs remind us that love may be simple, but it's never small. And you, have you ever been the one who's stayed for someone? Share it below, because maybe, just maybe, your story could be the light someone else needs.